Good afternoon. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. What comes to mind is a story from about an experience that I had about 20 years ago. And as a part of my job, I had to go through a training course to become a hazmat technician. And in this one particular exercise during the training, we had to put on some personal protective gear, and then we had to crawl through a tunnel that went in one side of a hill and came out on the other side. And I can remember walking out into the parking lot and seeing all the equipment gathered around, and the first thing we did was we put on our respirator mask, make sure we had a good seal. Then they'd put us in this Tyvek suit and would cover us all up. And then we'd put on our gloves and our booties, and they'd start putting the duct tape on to make sure there was a good seal. And then finally, for good measure, of course, was the big heavy harness with the tank on the back. And so we were sealed off from all of the outside elements. And fortunately for me, I was going through this exercise with a good friend of mine, my partner. And even better for me is that he had to go first. So I can remember getting down on our hands and knees and crawling into this tunnel. And as we're crawling through, I'm on my elbows and my knees, and you hear the respirator, and you have to work to breathe in that. And it started to get darker and darker and darker. And it had eventually gotten to the point where it was so dark that I could not tell the difference when my eyes were opened or closed, and I slowly started to feel panic setting in. I was starting to lose orientation with where I was in that confined space and my breathing being restricted. But what I did was I reached out ahead and I just kind of grabbed my friend's shoe. And as he was crawling, every time I would just touch his boot so that I had some orientation of where I was in the darkness. And it seemed like this went on for a long time, but eventually the light started to come in through that other end of the tunnel. And I felt so relieved that we were nearing the end and I was able to actually start to see what was happening. And I really have to say that I really grew in my appreciation for light. And I really did now understand being scared of the dark. Mm-hmm. So in today's lectionary, today's readings, if you listened, I think there's a really strong connection between our Old Testament reading with the prophet Isaiah and in Matthew's gospel. You see, the ancient Israelites back in the day, they would interpret their fortunes in life with their relationship with God. So when things were rough, when they were being oppressed, when they were being ruled over, when they were being enslaved, they always interpreted that time in their society as a hard time because of their sinful nature and their harming of their relationship with God. And then on the flip side, when their culture and their society and their relationships really started to prosper, they thanked God for having mercy on them. And so in this reading from the Old Testament, Isaiah goes into this area just north of the Sea of Galilee, and he's thanking God and he's praising God for having mercy on his people. These people that have walked in darkness have seen a great light. That yoke that's been on their shoulder has been lifted. That burden has been lifted. And he's praising them. And then if we fast forward about 700 years, Jesus himself, God who is the light, actually stepped foot in that same exact place where Isaiah was preaching to the Israelites. The light of the world had physically come to that part of the area. So when we talk about light and we talk about darkness, of course I shared with you a story about physical darkness, but what I'm really getting at is spiritual darkness, the spiritual darkness of sin. So how do we find ourselves in this spiritual darkness? Here's a few different ways that we might find ourselves drifting away from that light, moving farther along in that tunnel where it's getting dark. The first might be concealment, right? If there's something that we're ashamed of, something that we want to hide so no one knows, we know that if the light exposes that, we know that it's wrong and we're going to be ashamed of that. So we know in our hearts. that it's wrong. That's one way that we drift into the darkness. Another way might be to justify sin or evil or bad, right? And that's in our mind, trying to convince ourselves that what is really not good for us is good. But the problem there is that, you see, each of us has a conscience, right? We have that little voice in our hearts that is there to help us discern right from wrong, good from bad. And God placed that in our hearts to help us to navigate life. And what happens is, in our minds, we're saying this is good, and our conscience is saying, no, it's not. And what happens is there's a tension that starts to pull underneath the surface. And if the light shines on that, and that's exposed, many times what will happen is that tension will cause a violent reaction, right? It'll be a snap, a lashing out. We call that a prick of the conscience. And the third way, which I've often found myself in as I've learned to grow in my faith and learn about our faith and our church, is ignorance. And this is where we might be wandering off into the dark without even realizing that we're going off the path and we're moving away from the light. And I would equate this to a situation where maybe we're walking around in a room and it's dark, but we just walk past the light switch and we don't even think to turn it on. Or we walk past the window and we don't think to open the blinds to let the light in. So the cure for that is to form our conscience. To form our conscience through prayer and through study, through worship. And these are little things that we can do to help ourselves draw to the light. So one example is, in the morning when I'm driving to work, I usually like to listen to sports talk radio. All right, and I can guarantee you tomorrow I am not going to turn it on because I don't want to hear about the Giants' loss, okay? But there is an opportunity now where I can maybe turn on relevant radio. I can listen to a Catholic radio station and actually learn a little bit about my faith. You know, there's some great podcasts too, if you're into podcasts. Bishop Barron, Father Mike Schmitz. There's some wonderful resources there that doesn't take a lot of effort on our drive, on our commute. We can just listen. Another way that we can kind of draw ourselves back to that light is to examine our consciences. And this doesn't require a lot of effort. It really just requires a few minutes alone in bed at night before we turn the light off, before we set our alarm. We just sit there and we reflect on our day. And we ask ourselves, God, how was I today? Was I kind to those people that I encountered? Did I help the person that was in need? Can you help me be a better Christian tomorrow? And then finally, really the best way to draw us out of that darkness and into the light, those confessionals. Right? I know I've shared in some of my homilies before how really the most powerful spiritual formation that I've undergone is to make a real confession. That yoke, that burden that we carry on our shoulders of sin being lifted off, the joy that we can feel through that. I mean, can you imagine the joy that I felt coming out the other side of that tunnel, ripping off that mask, getting a drink of water and just kind of soaking in that sunlight? It's amazing. The people who've walked in darkness have seen a great light. Amen.